Hi, this is your dream chaser, Jeff Brown, and you're listening to Chasing Dreams with Amy J.
Welcome to Chasing Dreams podcast with Amy J. Amy believes that realizing a life without regrets is achieved by taking chances, chasing your dreams, making moves, and overcoming your doubts. The Chasing Dreams podcast will help you overcome life's obstacles, believe in your potential, and inspire you to face your fears. And now here's the woman who is passionately pursuing her dreams, Amy J.
Hey, Dream Chasers. This is Amy J, and you are listening to what I cannot believe is episode 99. That's right, guys. The last of the two digits. We are here. Not sure how it happened. I feel like we just started, but here we are, and I have a wonderful guest for you. His name is Jeff Brown, and he is the host and creator of the Read to Lead podcast, a top-ranked business and career podcast in iTunes. He spent 26 years in radio, and 6 of those years he co-hosted an award-winning and nationally syndicated morning show. Using his background and talents, Jeff's mission is to help you bridge the gap between intentionality and implementation. He does this through public speaking, mentoring, teaching, and most often through the Read to Lead podcast. Jeff is a firm believer in the mantra, leaders read and readers lead. And Jeff is actually one of the reasons we are here today, guys, to have this episode. And I just told him prior to this, he helped me in trying to do learning more about interviewing and how to improve podcasts. And we had a conversation where I was trying to find a coach to help me out. Unfortunately, finances doesn't allow that sometimes, but he still gave me enough information and knowledge to bring me here where we are today. So I had to thank him, and it was really important for me to get him here for 99 and was able to. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Amy. I'm honored to be here and really appreciate what you just shared. I try to be as generous as I can most of the time. I don't always feel like I accomplish that, but I was excited to learn that a couple of years ago, or whenever that was we last met, that you felt like I didn't hold back, despite the fact we weren't able to work together, that I was still able to help, because that to me is important, because I think that's what this is all about ultimately.
Yeah, and you're still sharing your gifts. I mean, we also, we've met several times and we've had conversations, and you've given value every time we have that conversation.
Oh, thank you.
We were talking just off the line before we started how sometimes we don't realize the things we do and the impact we have. And sometimes it just kind of continues. And you, I think, may not understand the impact you have with the actions you do. You have a number of fans and followers on your social media and Read to Lead stuff, but I am definitely one of them.
Well, thank you. That just warms my heart. I appreciate that very, very much.
And guys, doesn't Jeff have a voice for voiceover? He has one of those voices. So Jeff, you have a voice for voiceover, but also for radio, which you spent 26 years in. How do you even get into that? Was that a out of college thing? Was that college radio? How did that begin? It's hard. It might be hard to believe. I don't know, but it was by accident, really. It wasn't planned. My career path was determined at that time to have been something else. I was going to be a music teacher, and that's what I went to college for. I had dabbled with some radio classes in high school. My high school had a radio station, and I wanted to take some more classes along that path, but I had a guidance counselor taught me out of it, because at that time radio wasn't a part of the long-term plan. It's like, oh, you don't need to take those classes. And so I never was a part of that culture at my high school, never got to be on the high school radio station or anything like that. So I missed out on all that. Well, after 2 or 3 years in college as a music education major, I had come to the realization that was not something I ultimately wanted to do for the rest of my life. It was a path I had gone on because others had said, well, that's what you probably should do. You're a solid instrumentalist, and you have this, innate gift for understanding music and reading music, et cetera, et cetera. And so I went down that road. But after about 2.5 years, I dropped out and was out of college for about 3 years before eventually going back and getting a degree, just a general business degree.
But in that 3 years where I had dropped out, I came across upon this sort of new startup school for folks wanting to get into radio that was a 6-month sort of crash course in radio. We didn't have the internet back then. There weren't any online courses. This was an in-person course. I was the first student ever to sign up for this. I think it was called Professional Broadcasters Institute, and had my crash course in radio. And 6 months later, I finished the course, the first person to ever graduate from the school, and landed my first job in radio. And as embarrassing it is for me to admit, because it's going to make me sound really old, that all happened in 1987. And next month, actually this holiday that we're celebrating this year, July 4th of 2017, will be the 30th anniversary of my first day in a real job in radio. It was July 4th, 1987. So we're right at that point now.
Congratulations. It's quite the milestone.
It's been a long time.
It has, but let me ask you something. At that time, was broadcasting something that was easy to get into? Because, yeah, you took the course, you learned everything, but what was finding a position or opening something that was easy?
Well, getting it wasn't necessarily the hardest part. Keeping it was the hardest part. As funny as that sounds, the person running the school that I joined, a part of the attraction was guaranteed placement. And so he was a former radio guy himself, the guy heading up the school, and he had connections, and if he felt you were a solid student, he could see that you got placed somewhere. And I got, a part-time job. It was an hour and 15 or so minutes away from my house, so it was in another town. I didn't move there, but I made the commute every weekend, and sometimes would get a hotel and spend the night, so I wouldn't have to drive back home and then do my shift the next day. And then everything I made from that weekend would go to pay my hotel bill. So I was just, paying my dues, if you will. I mean, there are a lot of gatekeepers in traditional media. There always have been. And so I got a leg up on that by attending that school. Now, again, the hard part, though, is keeping it, because 9 months later, I was fired from my first job. In fact, I've been fired from just about every radio job I've ever had, except for, I think, one.
Wow.
And I've had half a dozen or so over the years. And that's kind of the nature of the business. It's very much or can be, what have you done for me lately kind of business. And your ratings are very important. And my first job that I lost, it was really just kind of dumb moves on my part more than anything. It wasn't that, I wasn't pulling my weight or wasn't, doing a good job on the air necessarily. It was just, I did stupid stuff. I did stuff that the market wasn't ready for. The things that I tried to do on the air were sometimes, pushing the envelope a little bit. And so after about 9 months of that, they got tired of me. And so
you were a rebel.
I was a bit of a rebel. In fact, they told me when they let me go that I should go work for a morning team that was headquartered in Indianapolis that later would go on to syndication and be nationally known. But they were huge in my hometown of Indianapolis. And I was told I should go try to get a job with that team. And I thought that was a major compliment. They didn't mean it as a compliment necessarily.
No.
I was like, that's awesome. I never did end up doing that, but I landed on my feet a couple weeks later with my second radio job. And it sort of snowballed from there. I was able to stay in the medium, obviously, for a long time. But I made some dumb moves along the way for sure.
Well, that's the interesting part. I'm going to call it fickle, but it's not that it's fickle. It's just the nature of the business. But for 26 years, you did this where you kind of were fighting for your job every day. Essentially, it seems like it's kind of that kind of a life to stay on and keep your job. I'm guessing and hoping that you loved it.
I did. Yeah, the first 21 or so of those 26 years, I was on the air. Mm-hmm. And that's why I got into it to begin with. And the last 6 years on the air, as you mentioned at the beginning, was as part of a morning show that I really enjoyed. And then my last 5 years in radio, I was behind the scenes and off the air. And that was by choice. I wanted to come off the air. I'd done it for a long time. And over that stretch of time, over a 21 year period, I kind of realized that being on the air meant being kind of, metaphorically speaking, and we chained to that room. You had to be in that studio 4 or 5 hours every day you were on the air. You couldn't be at your desk. You couldn't, be enjoying a meal with somebody. You could, you didn't have a lot of freedom because you were stuck doing that show 4 or 5 hours every single day. And so after 21 years of that, I was like, I need some freedom. I need to be able to get out more. I need to
right. You
go to
couldn't
the
work
bathroom when I
remote.
want to.
So let me take this from my office at home.
Yeah.
You couldn't do that back then. But,
no, that wasn't an option. No.
So when you first started it, did it click with you that this is something I love and want to do when you took that course at that school?
Yeah, and I'd always had a fascination with radio, and as I mentioned, I had kind of started going down that path in high school and just wasn't confident that's ultimately where I was going to go. So guidance counselors talked me out of it. But as a kid, I used to pretend I was a DJ in my bedroom, and I had a turntable, and then this is going to really date me here, an 8-track player and an analog radio dial, and I used to go back and forth and pretend to be a DJ and record I was fascinated with recording, and I got a tape recorder for Christmas one year, and so all that fascinated me a great deal. And so as I was going through that course, that sort of crash course, I was really excited about the potential of that industry and my place in it ultimately.
And so I guess that's the thing that interests me is the fact that you were doing something you love, despite the fact that every day or, whatever the risk is of keeping your job, that didn't bother you because you enjoyed what you were doing. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I think so. You kind of learn to put that aside and just, not worry about that because it's out of your control. You know that, listeners may love you one day and they may, decide that you're not all that in a bag of chips a couple of years later. Mm-hmm. And that's just, you use the word fickle. I think that's a good word to describe it. Tastes are fickle. Listeners can be fickle. Management can be fickle. Formats can be fickle. All those things can change. And, a radio station could change formats one day and decide that the entire on-air team is no longer appropriate for the new format. It could be things like that. And so, you just kind of learn to just go with it and be confident enough in yourself and your abilities that if something like that does happen, you can land on your feet somewhere else. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do that a few times.
Yeah. And be able to go out on your own note. It sounds like after 26 years, go out on your own choice on top. And so when you left, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do when you left? Were you going to retire and just take off for vacations to catch up now that you had that freedom?
Well, see, that's the funny thing. I didn't go out on my own accord. I had plans, and I talked to my wife about the possibility of me leaving at some point in the near future, and we were making sort of plans for what that might look like a few months down the road. And before we had a chance to really solidify any of that, the company I was working for had some restructuring, and they let 3 or 4 people go on the same day. I was one of those people. But when that happened, because of what I had been planning, there was never any thought of, I'm going to go try to find another radio job. It was, no, this is my push from the nest. This is my sign.
Right.
It's
earlier than you predicted, but
yeah, earlier than I predicted, but this is what's supposed to happen. And so, I moved my timeline up a little bit. And that was 4 years ago last week, actually. And, I had already started planning doing a podcast, and so that launched like a month from when I was let go that last time, and I went ahead with that. Didn't know what that was going to become, and didn't have any designs or anything thinking along the lines that I would monetize that eventually in some way or coach other people. And none of that was even on my radar at the time. It was just this was going to be a labor of love that I would do while I figure out everything else.
The great part is that you're continuing to use the skills you have and what you learned from radio as you're podcasting, but it's a new medium. It's something new that you were probably picking up. Or were you podcasting as you were kind of winding down and making these plans? Were you looking into it? What was it like trying to pick up a new skill?
Yeah, there were certainly, and there are certainly a lot of transferable skills, that's for sure. But there were still some things I didn't know. Some things I had to learn about the process. But I had the idea in around March of 2013, And then in April of 2013, I started making plans and doing research and kind of validating my idea. And then in May, I did things like purchase the equipment and get things set up and started scheduling some interviews. And then in June, I started doing some of those interviews. And then in July of that year, I launched. And so it was very methodical, one step at a time. First, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. And I didn't get in a hurry or anything like that about it. I just, developed a plan and worked from that plan and tried to, when I launched, sort of, as they say, have all my ducks in a row. And felt like when I launched that I had a pretty solid plan in place that was going to last for a while.
And it has. I mean,
so far,
knock on wood. But from that has also come other things within podcasting. Which did you anticipate coaching and helping other podcasters? Was that something that was anticipated, or just a blessed offshoot?
A blessed offshoot. I didn't anticipate it at all, honestly. In fact, it took some poking and prodding from others around me to convince me to actually step out and do it. And so I started it kind of reluctantly, Amy, to be completely honest with you. When I first stepped out on my own, I right off the bat started doing something full-time that I'd been doing in the margins of life when I had a full-time job. And that thing I'd been working on, sort of that side hustle, involved websites and in part mobile apps for small businesses who felt like they couldn't play the app game because they didn't have enough money for things like that. And I kind of tried to bring that to smaller businesses, mom and pop places, and help them figure out ways they could more, intimately engage with their customers. And mobile was one of those ways. And so when I first got let go, for the first 6 or 8 months, I jumped into that head first to kind of, keep my head above water until I was able to figure things out. And I was fortunate right before all this happened, right before I left that last job to be a part of a mastermind group that only recently came to an end with just 2 other guys. And these 2 guys were great around 6 months into this process of really pushing me to do this. Mm-hmm. I really didn't think I wanted to at first. I mean, I respected folks like John Lee Dumas, and who was stepping out into that space at the time, and Cliff Ravenscraft, and Pat Flynn has done a lot for podcasters. And
sure.
I thought,
yeah,
we don't need me. We don't need another person. We've got these folks over here doing a great job. What do I have to offer that? What ground can I cover that they haven't? And these guys convinced me that because, in part, my unique radio background and experience, I had a lot supposedly to bring to the table and to teach and to show people and things that nobody else was doing. And so that's kind of what I concentrated on in the very beginning. A lot of my early online courses and teaching and coaching and things of that nature centered around presentation and structuring of content and how to sound better than most people do out of the gate when you first launched it. Sound like you've been doing it for a while. Interviewing was a big focus of the process as well, because those were specific areas that others weren't necessarily touching on that I felt like I could speak to because of that experience. So because of their poking and prodding, I began to venture out into that, and it sort of snowballed from there.
Which I'm thankful for, because, interviewing is one of the things that led me to talk to you for the most part, especially because of your background. But I kind of want to talk a little bit about the people you surrounded yourself with. I mean, it sounds like one of the things you hear, surround yourself with positive people who support you. And so you went and started or joined a mastermind. Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, at the time I did, I had begun those conversations with my wife. I mentioned a moment ago, about, possibly leaving radio, and I didn't really know what that would look like, and I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do. It took me some time to figure that out, but I knew I was going to need a support system of other folks that I respected. And one of the other guys worked for the same company I worked for in another state or another city. And then the other guy was somebody he knew. And so, but he also had a lot of talents and expertise in areas that I did not have any. And so I saw that as attractive for me personally. I felt like I could bring something to the table for them. And I just knew, because of the respect I had for these folks, that they would speak truth to me. They would tell me when I'm, making a mistake, or when I'm listening to the wrong voices in my head, or when I'm, missing something that may be obvious to them, and that I would do the same for them. And so as I was planning out some of those, so the early timelines with my wife, I began sort of talking to some of my close colleagues about some of this. And one of them said, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting a mastermind. I'd love to have you in it. I've got one other person in mind. Would you be interested?" Yes, I would. And that started that simply. And it, like I said, it only recently ended, just sort of dissipated over time, just because the three of us have drifted in the sense that we're in different places than we were then. And so everything I think we could help each other with we've done. And so it's time for us to move on and find another group as individuals. But for that time we were together, it was fantastic. And I owe a lot of my success to those two people as much as anybody.
Would you recommend something like a mastermind, or someone chasing their dreams, to surround themselves with people like that and have some kind of relationship in that way? Absolutely.
I would recommend that. I don't know that you can be successful unless you're willing to spend a lot of time in rooms where you're not the smartest person. When I was young, I was very naive, and I would constantly try to put myself in a position, at least to feel, this wasn't necessarily always true, but to put myself in a position where I felt like I was the most talented person in the room, or the smartest person in the room. And that necessitated me limiting the groups of people I hung around, as you might imagine.
I hear it can happen.
But that gave me confidence in my own abilities, but it also limited me. That's what I didn't realize when I was young, was it stunted any growth I might have otherwise seen. And if I've learned anything in the last 30 years, it's that that's the worst thing you can do. The best thing you can do is surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. As the saying goes, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Mm-hmm. It just took me a long time to figure that out.
The other thing that I thought was interesting, though, is that you guys dissipated your mastermind. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing sometimes people forget, is that's okay to do. And you talked about the fact that you guys got the most out of each other. How did you realize that? Is that something that just kind of comes naturally, or a conversation you have with one another?
Well, it can happen a couple of different ways. Some groups I've been a part of are highly structured, and I've actually led a couple of my own where, there was a structure and a clock, and different things that we did for the hour that we were together were actually timed, and we made sure that everybody, had equal time and that sort of thing. And then others, like this one I mentioned that I was a part of, like the first one ever, was a little more loose. It was just three of us, right? And so it didn't have to be quite as structured. And we would oftentimes, still come with things we wanted to accomplish, things that we would share with one another that we were working on. And through continued communication, we would make sure that we were checking in with the other two in the group to make sure that they were following up on following through on their promises and meeting deadlines. And we knew when we came together every Monday evening that those things we mentioned last time we were going to be asked about, and we were going to be asked, how have you been doing on that, and how far have you gotten on that plan? And so there was sort of a built-in, accountability is one way to put it. And again, they had talents I didn't. They were gifted in areas in ways that I wasn't, and that was tremendous because for example, when it comes to writing email sequences, for example, I just hate doing that, and I don't even know where to begin. I look at the blank page and my eyes glaze over.
It's not your forte.
Well, not my forte. One of the two guys is highly gifted in that area, so he would go so far as to sometimes even write, an email for me and say, here's how I would approach this, or he would give me, places from which to start and just kind of, push me down the hill to give me some momentum, sort of thing. And so that things like that to me were just tremendous to have, especially, in areas where I just felt like were not my gift.
And did you feel that you were contributing as well? Because sometimes I know that if I'm in a group, I feel bad that I'm taking and I'm not giving. And I want to not be in that group because I feel like I'm taking advantage of it. Have you ever felt like that? Or
I have, and that's been a struggle for me. And I think we're all our own worst enemy, and we always feel like. In fact, I was just as this old mastermind is coming to an end. I was just recently asked to participate in a new one that I'm really excited about. But I look around the proverbial room, and I'm like, oh boy.
Here we are again.
What do I possibly have to offer them? Is kind of where my mind starts going, and I think that's self-doubt creeping in. That's imposter syndrome creeping in, and so I've learned a couple of things, and these will sound like really simple, like too simple, but they really, really work. What the other members of your mastermind group want from you is predominantly two things. And I learned this from a book I read called The Inspiration Code by Christy Hedges. And she's talking about how there's essentially a formula or a code to great conversations that can inspire your team. And if you'll follow this quote unquote formula, you'll inspire more people more often. And so from that book, I've learned these two things, that the two things you can do for other members of your mastermind group or any team you're leading or a part of is to, number one, be present. Oftentimes when I would meet with these two guys I mentioned a moment ago, it was virtual meetings, but we could see one another. And by being present, I mean blocking out distractions, letting others know who might otherwise interrupt you that this is precious and sacred time and that interruptions should be kept to a minimum, whether that's family or phone calls or whatever.
Putting your phone down?
Putting your phone shouldn't even be on the desk. I mean, it really needs to be respected. They need to know that you're present, and that's especially important to the other members when they're talking and sharing their struggles. And being present is going to help you master the other thing I was getting at, and that's just listening, just letting the conversation flow and go where it goes. And if you are truly present and not letting other things distract you, and they can see that, and you're actually listening without thinking about what you're going to say next, but just hearing what they're saying, those are two of the best things you can do. And if you can bring those to your mastermind group, even if you feel like you don't otherwise bring a whole lot of talent, if you can bring those things, the other members of the group will appreciate you for being there and will leave your meetings feeling like you've contributed, even though you might walk away and feel like, gosh, I didn't do anything but listen. That will be something and it's the case with most human beings, that will be something that they so rarely get. And just to walk away knowing you were present and you were listening will mean the world.
That's actually really great advice, because I think a lot of us, giving someone your time is precious, and we find, man, he listened to me. He gave me his time, his precious time, and attention, and it just makes me feel good.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really does.
I think when it comes to us, though, saying it, we forget that for whatever reason, we're like, it's just me, though. But if someone else does it for us, we're like, oh, he's an angel. God bless that guy. But when it's us, it's weird how that is. That, when it comes to someone else, if you put yourself in someone else's shoes, you can give the best advice. But taking it's entirely different and just as difficult. But that's actually something, speaking of the inspiration code, I believe that was an episode, or I saw it on your newsletter. I believe I heard you talking about the inspiration code, which I think was featured on the Read to Lead podcast. Am I right about that?
Well, you're a fortune teller, because I'm actually going to be interviewing the author on Friday.
That's what it was. I was like, I know we talked about this. Somehow I connected you in the inspiration code.
That's exactly right.
That's actually something really cool, because your Read to Lead podcast and your mantra of leaders read, readers lead, what brought that about?
Yeah, good question. I'm a big fan of a guy named Michael Hyatt, and have followed his blog for before anybody else hardly was blogging. He was in the forefront of blogging, and I live in Nashville. He lives in Nashville, and I was familiar with him as at the time he was CEO of a book publishing company called Thomas Nelson. and followed him while he still worked there. Then when he left, and then he started a podcast, and something he said once just stuck with me. And I believe he was quoting someone else. Maybe it was original to him. I don't remember for sure. But it was that leaders read, readers lead mantra. And that just always stuck with me. And when I came up with the idea to start my podcast, I thought to myself that the name of the show needs to come out of that mantra, needs to come from that somehow, some way. And so I just shortened it, I guess you could say, read to lead, just an abbreviated version of that same sort of concept and ideas. And I credit Michael with having inspired that name and sort of honing in on really what I wanted to do a podcast about. Because frankly, Amy, I thought about doing a podcast several years before I ever did one. And the reason I hesitated was because I spent the longest time thinking, what in the world would I do a podcast about? Yeah. I don't know. I didn't know even where to start. And things like that mantra and just my love for reading, they kind of crashed into one another. And I thought, gosh, this idea I've been looking for a podcast has been under my nose all this time. I just didn't recognize it. And I think that's the case for a lot of us. I found in attending some podcast conferences recently that one of the biggest areas of struggle for people, they know they want to start a podcast and they have a good idea of the things they need to do to make that happen. But many of them, more so than I realized, aren't really sure what to do a podcast about. They know they've got it in them, but they haven't pinpointed that just yet.
That's amazing. And you're now, as of this recording, you are at 173 episodes. Mm-hmm. And so is it safe to say that's 173 books you've discussed?
Pretty close. Yeah, there's been a handful of solo episodes in there where I've not interviewed somebody, where it was just me, but those are rare. Mm-hmm. And there's been a couple of episodes where I've featured, say, my favorite podcasts that happen to be hosted by authors. I've done some year-end special episodes, things like that. But for the most part, it's been an author interview. So out of those 173, probably 150 or so have been author interviews.
Have you read those books? 150?
Yes, I have. Now, I don't always finish every single book. Sure. When I first started my show, I thought I had to, and I had to ask a question, at least one question out of every chapter. And
oh, wow.
After a while, I realized, well, that's not really where I need to focus. I need to pull the key insights and main ideas. And basically what I do is I start reading. And as I read and questions that I want to ask or things I want to dig into come to me, I write those things down. And generally, an interview that I do might consist of 12 to 15 or so questions. And what I do is once I get to the point where I have that many questions, I give myself permission to stop reading if I need to move on to other things. If I don't have anything pressing, I can move right along. But I give myself permission to stop. And so sometimes I might read 6 chapters of a 10-chapter book before I get to 15, let's say, questions. Other times I might read 2 chapters and have 15 questions. And so,
wow.
It just depends on the book and the density of the book and all that. So it varies. How much of a book I read varies, but I have delved pretty heavily into most all of those books. With very, very few exceptions. There are 1 or 2 instances where my interview ended up happening before the book got into my hands. Mm-hmm. But those are tough interviews to do for me, especially when I base my questions off my reading, as you might imagine. But I made a couple of exceptions along the way because they were authors whose work I'd known for years. Chris Brogan was one. Seth Godin was another. But I based my questions off of, in some cases I had chapter titles I could go from. In other cases I could look at their blog, and any author is also blogging about his or her book as they're in the process of writing it. And I could go back and look at blog posts and come up with questions that way. But other than those 2 instances I can think of, yeah, I've read them all.
That's amazing. But it's probably also your work ethic. But you actually said something I want to touch on real quick. You gave yourself permission. What does that mean? Like, I mean, did you ask yourself if that was okay? Is that something you typically do? I'm familiar with the concept, but I'm not sure a lot of people understand that concept of giving yourself permission. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't really thought about that, but you're probably right. That may be foreign to a lot of folks. Yeah, I used to believe that, unless I read a book from cover to cover and finished it 100%, then I wasn't allowed to say, well, I read such and such book. If I was going to mention a book in conversation or what have you, I would have to say, well, I got through the first 8 of 10 chapters, but I didn't read the whole thing. Like anybody cares, right? But I didn't feel like I could say I've read the book unless I'd finished the book. And I came to realize over time that with nonfiction anyway, that's not necessarily the case. Not every word in every nonfiction book is critical to our personal growth and to improving our leadership skills. There may be concepts the book discusses that we're well versed in. So if that's the case, why would you spend your time necessarily, if you didn't have a lot of time, reading about something you already knew intimately when you could be spending that time learning something new, right? And so I began over time thinking and allowing myself to still say, and not like I'm having conversations with people about this all the time, but I allowed myself to still feel and say, well, if I've picked up that book, if I've read most of it, if I've conducted an interview on it, et cetera, I've read that book. It doesn't have to be read cover to cover. It doesn't mean I haven't read it. I can say I've read that book. And so it was just about me getting over this mental hurdle of what reading really was, particularly in the nonfiction space. And I just always had this mentality for whatever reason that I had to get all the way through it. And if not, then I had somehow let the author down or failed in some way. And I just had to let go of that. And the way I let go of that, let go of that was just by saying, sort of to myself, it's okay. It's all right if you don't get all the way through it. No one's counting the pages. No one's looking over your shoulder. No one's going to think any less of you because you didn't read word 1 to word 70,000 or whatever. So.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful concept, giving yourself permission, and something I think a lot of us need to do more of is giving yourself permission to dream, to chase your dream, or even, small things like, yes, you read the book, you can stop reading now, it's okay.
And I think that goes for a lot of things. I think you hit on something there. I've had to learn over the years to give myself permission to do a lot of things I didn't necessarily feel ready to do. And a lot of us, I think, spend our lives waiting for somebody to wave the magic wand or dub us worthy to be doing this thing or that thing. And, I mentioned traditional media, and oftentimes there are gatekeepers whose job it is to keep you out, and you have to get permission from them to do what it is you want to do. But we live in a world today where that's less and less necessary for doing the kinds of things you're doing. You don't need somebody else's permission to do that. Likewise, for me, I don't need somebody else's permission. But there are still things we run up against, and it happens to me a lot, where I start, that doubt creeps in, the imposter syndrome again comes back, and you're like, well, who are you to do that? Or you're not as good at that as these other people over here, or maybe you're not as good at that as you think you are.
Yeah.
And so we sit back and go, well, then I'm not going to do that thing because I'm not ready. If I can just get to the point where I believe in myself enough, then I can go do that thing. And I love something that Seth Godin said on my show once that applies to this. He says, we don't take action because we believe. That's backwards. We actually believe because we take action. So rather than thinking that before you take action, you've got to build up enough belief in yourself to do this thing or that thing, Seth says, just start doing it. And Jeff Goins, a friend of mine, has just released a book called Real Artists Don't Starve that delves into this a little bit as well. Instead, just start doing it. If you want to be a writer, just start writing, as Jeff puts it. And over time, other people will start looking at you through a different lens. And that lens is the lens of, in this case, a writer. And as people do that, guess what? It starts rubbing off on you. And so take the action and have the faith that the belief will follow, rather than trying to start with the belief and hoping that you drum up enough of it that you get the courage to take action. And Seth punctuated that with these simple words. He says, do first, believe second.
That's deep.
Isn't it, though? And it's not my words, Seth Godin's words, and it's impacted me greatly.
I can see why. 4 words, 4 simple words. Those are great words to like end it on, but we can't just yet. Before we can, Jeff, we need your words on what is one thing on this 99th episode when Dream Chasers are listening. What is one action you would tell them to take today to chase their dreams?
Well, I think it dovetails with what I was just talking about with Seth. This idea of acting first and just knowing that over time, these little baby steps that you take, though they may not feel like they're making a big difference now, know that as they add up, they will. I think a lot of podcasters miss this. You're an example of somebody who hasn't missed this. I'm sure there were times over the last 99 episodes where you considered, should I still be doing this? Is anybody listening? Should I throw in the towel? I know I had those feelings myself.
Yeah.
And as you do it more and more, episode after episode, in the case of my friend Jeff Goins, I mentioned a moment ago, he decided, I'm just going to start writing every day. And he did that for about 2 years. John Grisham, the author of A Time to Kill and The Firm, he was a lawyer, and Jeff talks about that in his book. He wrote every day. He wrote a page a day for 2 years and published A Time to Kill, and hardly anybody bought it. But he thought, that was fun. Let's do it again. And so he started writing every day again for about a year the second time, and he wrote The Firm, and that got published and picked up, and it was a runaway bestseller. And then they came back, I think, and re-released A Time to Kill, and it did better. And it was after, I think, a total of about 4 years of doing this that John finally went, you know what? I think I'm going to quit my day job, and I'm just going to be a full-time writer. He didn't just, you hear that phrase, take the leap,
Sure. Yeah.
He didn't do that. Didn't do anything like that. He took baby steps. Jeff did that. I think I did that in a lot of ways. You've been doing that with every episode you release. That's another step towards something even grander and more awesome than what you're already doing. And I think a lot of people miss that. They want the success right now, and they don't understand these little things that you do day to day. Read the book, The 12-Week Year, if you don't do anything else in regard to this. Read the book, The 12-Week Year, and it talks about how you should think about a 12-week period, a quarter, as a year. A month is a quarter. A week is a month. A day is a week. And when you start thinking about time in those terms, suddenly what that does for you is the 5 things you do today, you see how that impacts weeks from now much more readily, much more easily. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so if you can break down your year into 12-week increments and think of a year in that sense as a 12-week period and set your goals that way and work backwards from that 12 weeks to today, then I think that's going to have a huge impact on seeing these little things that you do day to day, how they affect the big things that you really want to accomplish.
I love that. And I love that recommendation. I am a fan of the 12-week year. I think it's
Awesome.
a very powerful book. Also, again, a simple concept of, why wait a year
Right,
to
right.
do everything when you can get it done in 12 weeks? Because, I think if you think about it, we do it and tend to delay things, push things off. And it's a very powerful book, guys. The link for that will be in the show notes. You can check it out there. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show. It means a lot to me. You've been fantastic. All the best with Read to Lead podcast and everything you're doing.
Well, thank you, Amy. As a treat to be here. I've been enjoying watching what you've been doing these last couple of years, and hope that I was able to provide some insight along the way to somebody who needs it today. So thank you for that opportunity.
And guys, that was Jeff Brown. How fantastic is he? When I first started talking about chasing dreams, I wanted to make sure I got interviewing right. I didn't think it was a skill I have. or had at the time that was strong. And so I was looking into podcasters and who could help with interviewing and podcasting. And, Jeff's name came up. And so looked into him, we reached out and we talked, and he gave me so much information. And I saw him at workshops talking about interviewing skills. And, he's a big part of why Chasing Dreams is what it is today and the interviewing skills I have here. So hopefully you guys got as much from this interview as I did. And, because he was just dropping knowledge left and right. So hopefully you guys caught all of that. If not, no worries. It is a podcast. Rewind back, listen again, or check out the show notes page over at chasingdreamshq.com/episode 99. That's episode 99. And guys, next week we bring you episode 100. I know that was a little bit much, but I'm very excited. I'm so excited because not only are we into triple digits, but next week's guest is very important to me. And that's all I'm going to say. And so until next time, guys, keep chasing.
Thank you so much for listening to Chasing Dreams. Amy would love to connect with you and hear all about your pursuit of chasing your dreams. Connect with her on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram via @ChasingDreamsHQ. Or you can find Amy on Twitter @AmyJ21. That's AIMEEJ21. Be sure to visit headquarters over at chasingdreamshq.com for more inspiration, motivation, and resources to help with your own dream chase. We hope you'll join Amy next week. And until then, keep chasing.